Urbit as a thing, right, is sort of saying, look, the internet is hosed. This territory isn't interesting anyway. We're just going to create an entirely new territory that we think has like rules that actually make sense. And we're going to let people explore it and develop it. That's both fun like for us. And the idea is to make it fun for other people too.
All right, everybody, what's going on? This is the Other Life Podcast. I am Justin Murphy. This episode is one in a whole series all about Urbit. Urbit is a whole new computing and networking paradigm that many of you know I've become very interested in recent months, really recent years, the past couple of years or so. I think Urbit is just way crazier and way cooler than most people realize. I think a lot of people are sleeping on Urbit and just don't really know about what's going on with it, what it is, and all the cool, badass people building Urbit, building things on Urbit, creating on Urbit. And so now the development of the technology is really picking up and moving faster. I decided that when the Urbit annual conference came to town in Austin this past October, that I would sit down with 10 different people all across the network, people who are building the technology, people who are creating on the network, and people just in this culture that still I think a lot of people don't know much about. So I can honestly say this was one of the most interesting experiences I ever had at any kind of conference, to be perfectly honest. I spoke with CEOs, I spoke with engineers, I spoke with e-girls from weird theory Twitter. Like, I'm not talking about Instagram chicks, I'm talking about like weird theory girls in, you know, the Other Life neck of the woods of the Twitterverse and the blogosphere. I talked with skitzed out writers and post everything podcasters, and very possibly I spoke even with an alien. I'm only half kidding. It was just wild, man. It was really, really wild. Really, really interesting set of characters you're about to meet over the next 10 episodes. And I'm just super pumped to bring this series out into the world. So real quick, before I forget, I do want to let you know, if you're interested in Urbit, it's now easier than ever to get onto the network. So I actually have a bunch of Urbit planets, aka Urbit ships, pretty much computers in the cloud, an individual computer in the cloud that can be yours. It also functions as your identity, and it's what you use to log onto the network and to use Urbit. So if you want to, I'll give you one. I have a bunch, and any listener of the show, I want to get you on Urbit. So you can just go to imperceptible.computer. I made a whole site just for this purpose. And yeah, drop your email and I will get you a planet, aka an Urbit ship. All right. Depending on whether you're listening to this now or 2 years from now, there may or may not be some kind of modest fee associated with it. Right now, I'm just giving them out for free. You don't need to have any coding or programming skills or experience whatsoever. It's very straightforward. I will give you your own planet and you'll be on the network playing around, talking to people in 5 minutes, probably. Okay. That's imperceptible.computer. I will put a link in the show notes. And the final thing real quick, and then we'll get on to the show. This whole series was a labor of love. It was my idea. No one paid me to do it. I did, however, find eventually sponsors so that it wasn't at all done at a loss. And I'm very grateful to those sponsors. So this episode in particular is sponsored by the Dalton Collective. Dalton is the name of the first collectively owned and managed Urbit star. It's a membership organization run on Urbit, of course, that's focused on fellowship, sustainability, and sovereignty. Dalton, it's a small group. It's a private group. They're not advertising because they want to build their membership massively or anything like that. It's a small private group, but they do have a public channel. So listeners of the podcast might want to go check out what they're up to, say hi to them. And, you know, if you're interested in those values, as am I, then you might find the Dalton Collective interesting. And they're one of the earliest groups really kind of building community on Urbit. So shout out to them. Big thanks to the Dalton Collective for sponsoring this episode. And I will put a link in the show notes to the Dalton Collective. All right. That's all from me. Let me get out of the way and on to the show. So the first question I want to ask you about has to do with the preponderance of designers in the Urbit ecosystem. Because Urbit is such a technical project. It's extremely technical. Yeah. It's confusing even to some of the most technically minded engineers. Yeah. And yet it seems to be run by a bunch of designers. Yeah. Yeah. So I know you are an architect.
That's a good question.
I know your background is as an architect.
Yeah.
And I know you're technically sophisticated, but I would think of you today mostly as a designer. And people like Ed, who did the podcast this morning, it's a lot of designers. Yeah. And so I think it's kind of unique. It's unique among highly technical technology companies to have so many designers per capita relative to the engineers. Like I would imagine the CEO of a company such as Tlon, the main company driving Urbit up until recently, would be an engineer. So what's up with the culture of designers steering this highly technical technology ship? How does that work? Was that a strategic decision? Was it an accident? Is it an advantage or a disadvantage? Just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. This is pretty easy to dig into. And there's all kinds of like other rabbit holes to go down. So, I mean, Urbit is a design project, I think, like even as a technical project. A lot of the things that like people bounce off of and find confusing about it technically, I think of as being almost like aesthetic decisions about how something should be. And I don't mean that like they're fussy or it's like overthought. Actually, it's like it's designed in a particular way to have a particular function. Which I wish I had an easy way to communicate to people who are in the process of bouncing off of Urbit, right? Like when you look at something often, or you see people looking at Urbit and thinking, oh, this is so strange. And it's like, well, usually the thing you're finding strange, you know, more often than not, it used to be that sometimes you're finding something strange that's actually maybe unfinished. So this is one of the worst things. Here's a good rabbit hole. Like one of the things that was really tough about Urbit, I think for a long time was it was just unfinished. So it's like a design project from the start. You want to build this completely new platform and it's sort of well reasoned as a whole thing, but there are many parts of it that are unfinished. So people would dive into it and then get lost thinking like, wait, okay, is this supposed to be like this? Or is it something that you haven't quite figured out yet? That's like deeply annoying and confusing. And I empathize with people who got lost in those weeds. But yeah, I think that like anyway, to answer the high level question, to start with like the rationale behind, you know, why does this attract design people in general? I do think that, you know, Urbit as a thing comes out of like is built or kind of grows out of this basic intuition that like some other type of technology for networked computing is possible. And that's a design project in its spirit, right? Like that's how design works, right? You have this sense that something can be made and then you go figure out how to make that thing. And so I think that, yeah, I always had this conflict about calling myself a designer because it sounds like you're a graphic designer. And I always, kind of feel spiritually like what I do is much closer to architecture. And actually, I think that that's what I liked about Urbit originally. And actually, that's what I liked about working with Curtis. I think Curtis, and we can go down this rabbit hole if you want, but yeah, I think Curtis as like a software architect is very brilliant. And we had a good time working together on basically making architectural decisions about like what Urbit is technically and what its motivation is in terms of how it can be used. So yeah, I think that kind of being in the DNA of Urbit technically is what attracts, I mean, Ed in many ways is more of like a visual designer, but there's, you know, the reason that Urbit is built the way that it is as a piece of software is so that it can be used in a certain way. And those two pieces like have to be very tightly connected. So I think it's sort of like natural. I think that, I mean, one way to think about it really, and this was very on the table between Curtis and I was like, I think Curtis had this intuition for something as possible technically and knew that ultimately the point of building this new, simpler system was to make it usable or useful or directly materially like understandable by people. But I think he also knew he couldn't do that. And so that was kind of the like original partnerships. I'm like, well, that's what I want to work on. And like, I know that like, that's a very significant design project of the type that I'm like qualified to take on. Okay. I mean, many great like works of technology have this kind of, you know, two halves, right?
Sure. So maybe that's a nice segue to learn a little bit more about the origin story. You know, how did you meet Curtis? Yeah. How did you first get involved? Take us back to the early days.
Yeah. They're not that interesting.
Sure.
I found Urbit on Hacker News.
Yeah.
I think that's like a well-known story. I had studied architecture and I was interested in kind of like the way I see it, like the history of civilization is kind of written in like the plan drawing of ancient cities or something, right? If you look at the way the city changes, you can see the way that culture shifts in the things that people made and how they made them. Cities and the way that they are built, like, I mean, just the discipline of architecture in terms of building buildings, especially for me anyway, in school is like not that interesting because it's been sort of very systematized. So the way that we live in the physical world, like this is a great example, right? This is like, we could be anywhere in a way right now, right? Like, and that's fine. I mean, maybe it's a problem, but who cares, right? Like computers actually organize the way that we think. Getting
the camera line of sight. You're good though.
Okay. And so, yeah, so I think computers organize the way we think. They organize the way that we are sort of like form communities, the way that we, the way that culture works.
Totally.
Right. So I was thinking a lot about, like, I was primed to think about that stuff by the way that by the time I came out of architecture school, and I was looking at every possible, basically alternative to the way that centralized software, or like just conventional software, was being built. Because I guess my take was like, this shit is not going to last. Like, there's just no way. Even giant, Facebook, Google, whatever, the way that this works, like, doesn't look like something that you would, like, let's fast forward 100 years, 200 years, 500 years. Is it likely that you would look back at like the empire of Google or the empire of Facebook as like a cultural relic and think like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Of course, like the empire of Google lasted hundreds of years. Like, no, like it's weird. Like, it's a little kingdom and like that's cool, but it's fragile and it doesn't seem like realistic.
Not built to last.
Yeah, not at all.
So you were already thinking about these things.
So that's where my mind was. And I was looking at every So yeah, like I was looking at Bitcoin, looking at and I grew up around a lot of cypherpunk. So I was interested in basically anything that you could run yourself, and then trying to figure out how you could bridge these things that you could run yourself that, were potentially very durable, very secure, and just seemed like a more like natural way to compute.
And were you a practicing architect, or you just came out of architecture school? Yeah,
so I went to architecture school, but I went to an unusual architecture school that's sort of like grounded in like hand drawing and making things in the physical world, and kind of like a Beaux-Artsy. It's like a very disciplined place that's not, a lot of people don't leave there and go and do actual architecture. So by the time I was done with school, I was pretty sure I was not going to be building buildings.
And you were more interested in software?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I grew up building software. I grew up near Silicon Valley, kind of close enough to get it. And so, yeah, this was all clear to me by the end of school. And then I was just kind of like looking at every possible thing.
And then one morning you open up Hacker News.
I mean, it was literally like I was looking at a bunch of other stuff and thinking, okay, could you take this and productize it in a way where you could make a really great product that would be an alternative to some centralized thing that would actually be better than the centralized thing? And yeah, I think it was really the thing that was super attractive to me about Urbit in like 2013 when I first found it is that it was like 5-10 minutes and I could be using the thing and playing with it. And it actually worked really well. And if you were familiar with the problems it was solving, like running its own network, letting you actually run code over the network, those were things that, I mean, there's a lot that was broken about Urbit in 2013, or it's like very prototype grade, but it's super impressive. You're like, holy shit, this is like someone has gone like way beyond what anyone else is doing and has thought like more deeply about these things. So yeah, I think I went to the first talk that Curtis, like one of the only Urbit talks, that was just like a lightning talk. And yeah, I knew nothing else about Curtis, which is probably part of why it worked, right? Like we personally got along really well. And I thought I knew based on my own experience, basically like this is someone who's like a very talented software architect. And we had just like really complementary skill sets, and could also, like productively fight with each other. I think, yeah, we're both people who are kind of like, look, you should be able to ask any question. And like, it's the way to sort of work out the answer to something is like get in the ring and figure it out.
Right.
So it was very quickly like, yeah, like a super productive collaboration, basically.
Okay. Right on. Fascinating. And so, I mean, while we're talking about you initially meeting Curtis and getting involved, now would probably be a good time to ask a little bit about how it's been navigating Tlon with Curtis and then without Curtis, with Curtis being such a controversial figure.
Yeah.
So maybe tell us the story about, I mean, obviously for a while, Curtis was somewhat radioactive. I think less so now for his controversial writings and ideas. And, he's a fascinating thinker who, thinks in many different directions and doesn't really hold himself back in any way. And in today's day and age, it's very hard to have someone at the front of a company who's like that.
Yeah.
So what was that like? Tell us what kinds of challenges did you face from that fact?
Yeah.
And how was it, how did you end up steering through that?
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, it's a long history, right? There's a lot that happened there. So yeah, like I said, I didn't know anything about, I mean, I think I'd like Googled Curtis, like I read some of the early, I remember reading some of the early, like kind of more economics focused, like Googled, found the blog, read like an economics post or two. And I was like, okay, this is kind of interesting. why are these so long? Like, like I was just like, I'm not reading this. Like, get this guy an editor, you know, like I'm not. And I already knew, I think this was maybe the like theme of like the early controversy surrounding Urbit is that, yeah, my sort of direct experience with this person is like a very friendly, very like open-minded and actually like somewhat uncertain of the things that he was being trashed for. I was like, you know, I don't know. Like it doesn't really line up like with my experience but certainly, yeah, with regards to like, how is this going to affect the future of this thing? For me, it was sort of like, I don't know, but like this thing seems good. Like it seems good.
I feel like there's kind of two types of people. There are people who make their judgments about other people primarily through their personal contact. And it's like, I'm definitely that kind of person also. It's like if I know someone and I've been working with someone even slightly or tangentially for a little bit of time, but I've had enough repeated interactions with them that I have a mental model of who they are. Yeah. And that mental model is not bad or sinister in any particularly profound way. Then there's basically nothing I could read in the newspapers that's ever going to like change my basic mental model of them basically. Yeah. And on the other hand, there are other people who are like, if they find one negative thing in the newspaper, they'll like throw in the dustbin their entire kind of experienced memory of you because that's just a certain type of personality that can't handle that.
I think it's stressful. Like it's hard to sort of like tease apart like a story that is getting a lot of traction from like, from reality. I think there's probably, I mean, look, Curtis and I are actually very different and think very differently about things. So I think that the crux of it was that maybe two things. A, that like us hashing out those differences was generally a lot of fun and super engaging, super spirited, and was kind of created even at the company in the early days, which was tiny, you know, it was like 5 people or so. There's like this culture of like, look, you need to reason from first principles. Like you may believe something and you might be able to think you can defend it, but if you can't actually like thread the needle from like, you know, very foundational principles all the way through to how you want to implement something, like we're not even going to entertain, you know, you know, we're not going to, it doesn't matter basically. And it's also like, we're an engineering or design, you know, we make stuff. So at the end of the day, I think that's an important part of a culture of people who are making things, right? Like either it works or it doesn't work, right? And either it's going to survive or it's not going to survive. Like, and Urbit obviously is all about like basically robustness, durability, simplicity. Like we're aiming to produce something that should be able to be, you know, evaluated. I don't know about like objectively, but everyone should be able to look at it and say like, okay, this is actually going to work well.
Right.
And so, I found that generally that as like, and coming from like an academic background where like critique and pretty like intense critique is a big part of how you make decisions and how you make things. I was like, this is good. Like we're right. I felt internally like pretty confident that we were like on the right track.
Well, one of the reasons that I ask about that is just because I guess I kind of see Tlon as a successful case study in a way of navigating kind of the current kind of cancel culture moment or whatever you want to call it. And now it's like you see, you know, CEOs like Brian Armstrong, and it's now more common actually for especially companies in tech to kind of go at this more aggressively, more forthrightly, and basically try to get out in front of it. In a way, you know, because Curtis was so controversial for a time. I think less so now. Now he's, you know, seems to be on every podcast out there, and now it's like, you know, I think he's doing well for himself, you know, as a thinker, and people are. He seems like less, you know, stigmatized nowadays, which is good for him. But you all got through that, you know, in a way, and you kind of weathered the storm. And Tlon, you know, keeps on humming, and it's still doing its thing. In a way, I kind of see the current wave of CEOs like Brian Armstrong getting out in front of it as kind of like, you know, they can now do that in a way because companies like Tlon kind of weathered the storm of these waves of like public, you know, cancel culture or whatever you want to call it.
I have met Brian, but I don't think we ever talked about any of this. So I don't know whether Tlon can take any credit for that, but we definitely navigated this stuff like early on.
Are there any like lessons in there, like observations or lessons that you had that probably could maybe benefit a lot of people who are maybe navigating their own companies with maybe a controversial, you know, person on the team?
That's such a good question. Well, I think for us specifically, like Urbit is definitely designed to be, and through, you know, continuous iteration aspires to be something that can support, you know, many, many different kinds of people who don't even necessarily like each other or want to acknowledge that one another exist. And so in general, you know, cultural conflict can be good and clarifying, like also like the things that you agree on, basically, right? So it's a good practice, I think, to be able to say, look, these are ways in which we are different. We're just going to like actually we can identify, kind of like draw the lines around them and set them aside and figure out like what we actually want to share. So I think there's a lot of that actually, like even in the DNA of like how this country was set up and the sort of like framework that you try and generate to get a bunch of factions to coexist. And so I think in order to build systems like that, you have to kind of go through it, right? You have to be familiar with what that kind of conflict is, and also then like how to, just like draw lines around it and kind of contain it. Not very good advice though. I mean, I think like,
what about just like the sheer will? Like, I'm sure there were times, must have been moments where, the kind of political pressure or anxiety on someone like you was so great that like, were there times where like you almost thought about throwing in the towel, or like, I have to like do something drastic to handle this? How do you get through? Cause you held on, right? And it's like you didn't jump ship. So like, what kinds of heuristics or like ideas are you going through going through those kinds of challenges?
Yeah, it's so the thing that's really different, right, is that we went through all this stuff really early on, like when we didn't have a lot to lose. And I think I come from, I don't know, it's like I grew up skating and like going to punk shows and stuff like that. And so I guess my kind of like, I'm pretty stubborn about like, I don't know how to, like, we're going to make something that's really great or we're going to die, and it's like, and so I think that it came from all this stuff going on. It seems scary or it seems worrisome in some way, but it's like, look, none of that stuff really matters. Like all that matters is that this thing is actually as good as it should be. And we can figure out whether or not it matters to anybody.
I'm getting the vibe that basically what you're saying is like, you just hang everything on the vision and the product. And it's like, if it wins, then you win. If it doesn't win, then you lose. And no drama about individuals is really going to matter either way.
Yeah. Like all that stuff, you're like, okay, is this substantive to what we're making? And so I think the big risk for us was like, that we kind of like become the like right-wing crypto project or something like, which both, interestingly, like Curtis was probably more worried about than I was, but we both are kind of like, look, this is not a niche product, like this is supposed to be an open platform that lots of different people use in a very sort of serious way. And I think we both just felt like, a lot of the stuff that was going on is like, it's just like not material to what we're really doing. And the thing that we would see a lot, like actually, I can't tell you how many times I would have people come to me at Urbit events and be like, oh, hey, I found out about you guys because of some great controversy. Right. And like, I'm not interested in Curtis at all, but I'm really excited about Urbit. And what I figured out was here because of like all this stuff that was going on. I always kind of felt like maybe it also gives me I have a different perspective maybe on like why, my feeling about like the problems of social media, maybe partially influenced by this, is that it's totally by design because it's like, it's so good for engagement. Like people love this stuff. Right. And if you it's like maybe, medium versus the message thing, right? Like don't get caught up in the message. Like, I don't know if people care that much, like they're not really, very few people are motivated around these things on either side, no matter what the issue is. Most people do not care. But what you should look at is like what people do, meaning what do they spend time on? What do they spend money on? And what I was finding is like people really like what we're working on and they want to help us and they want to, and I'm like, okay, well, we should just keep going.
I think that's a really good, simple rule of thumb, basically. Maybe it does to get through any kind of crazy public political drama of any kind. It's just like stay lightning focused on what you're building. And it is because it is a good point. It is actually like it's having a controversial person on the team who's maybe, drawing some kind of political or public, flack of some kind is really just a short-term break or pressure in a way that just like public, like good press is also like a short-term win, right? It's like, there can be tailwinds or headwinds, but they're really just going to like help you or make it slightly difficult in the short term. They're really like you either have something that is the truth and you win, or you don't have the truth and you lose.
I do think that's ultimately true. I will say though, also like, when a lot of this stuff would go down, like I take these people serious. Like it's worth taking your detractors, empathize with them, like understand what they're saying, try and understand them on their own terms. And I think there are plenty of things that Curtis gets dragged for that he like totally deserves to take shit for, like to the to the degree of like, taking away his livelihood or what, it's like very extreme. Probably not. But sometimes I also think like the cool thing about, America or the West, like Western culture writ large, right, is that we generally, we want to tolerate people that are different than us, and not just tolerate, like we like having lots of people around us who are different than us. Right. And so I think that, even in those situations where someone is coming at you because they disagree with you, it's kind of part of the deal. Like, and it's interesting, like you learn things from it, and you should be open to learning from it too. I think it's like, you shouldn't just assume that if someone is, coming after you for whatever it is, that they like are, completely insane. I mean, they may very well be completely insane, but also maybe they have a point and it's interesting and you should like understand it regardless.
Totally. Well, that's two things you and I have in common. We're both skater kids who love America. That's what's up.
Skateboarding is a real patriotic act.
Hell yeah. That's super American. It's also, skateboarding is very anarchist and kind of like cypherpunk in a way, because you're constantly eluding control. You're constantly running from cops, and you're basically, you have this like little gang where you're basically like your neighborhood and the highways around like your suburb are like this kind of Wild West territory that you and your anarchist like cowboy buddies are just exploring and trying to evade capture. So there's an interesting vibe.
Skate culture is like is also competitive, right? In a really healthy way that I think that's one of the things that I think of as being the most like beneficial to me personally. Basically, I mean, it fosters a kind of like you are competing very much with yourself. Like you're trying to do things that are potentially going to get you hurt or whatever, like that are just hard to pull off. And you're always competing with your friends at least a little bit.
Right.
And that culture, but it's self-directed. It's not like playing a team sport or something there's like a measurable outcome.
It's self-directed. And also there's never really like a final score.
Yeah.
It's like that, you're maybe like seeing who can do like the better kickflip or whatever, but it's not like anyone comes in at the end of the day and is like, you win, you lose. You're just kind of like constantly upping the ante, right?
So there's this you develop like an internal sense of what is good and what is not good, and like whether or not you can do something. And so, I mean, I like, you can see some of that in some of my thinking about stuff like this, where I'm like, you need to have your own sense of like whether or not this is the right thing to do or whether or not you're being successful or whatever.
I love it. Yeah, no, it's totally true that skateboarding induces this kind of whole life ethic in a way. It's true. It really does breed people who basically kind of are inclined to go off on their own, build something big, because when you're learning a skateboard, especially if you're passionate about it, you're like spending like 4 hours in the street every day, just like doing kickflips or whatever, trying to get that 360 flip down or whatever. It's like hours and hours by yourself. And you're basically just doing it because it's fun and because you want to achieve the capability. And so it really breeds for that kind of patience and building in relative isolation over long periods of time, just for the sake of it, basically. And it also comes with a kind of irreverence, a kind of disregard for authority, because to do the sport, you have to basically break rules all the time. Like you're constantly getting shooed away by security guards and stuff like that. So it's like to do it with your friends at all, to go out and do it, you are basically anti-authoritarian and anti-rules.
It's all about
you want to be.
It's very like internally. I think music can be like this too. I mean, surf culture has some of this. Like it's like spread around, but like learning to be kind of. I think it's like you just have to learn to have your own sense of like your own standards. But I think a design education like is similar in a way, right? Like maybe so, like there's something about like you learn fundamentals and then you also learn to like figure out how your take on them and this kind of like productive tension between those things. Right. I mean, if I knew exactly what that, like resume was, then that's exactly what I'd say we were hiring for.
Okay. So what did you learn from, or rather tell us about who is Christopher Alexander and what was the biggest lesson that you took from him?
Good question. Well, I'm probably going to repeat myself here, which is maybe okay. But for those of you who've already heard me talk about it.
I don't think I know the spiel, so go ahead. Don't be shy.
Okay, so the first caveat is that I'm actually not a total Christopher Alexander expert, like by any means.
Okay.
I think what was relatively sort of mind-blowing to me about Christopher Alexander, coming from the sort of school of architecture and architects that I was trained in, is that they're totally kind of diametrically opposed. I come from a kind of like formalist postmodernist world that's like very New York centric. And Christopher Alexander, of course, is British and then ends up in California and has a very different take on kind of like what makes a successful building. So towards the end of my architecture education, I started reading his thesis, which is amazing. I think is still worth reading, is kind of like foundational if you want to understand his thinking in general.
What's the title of that one?
Notes on the Synthesis of Form.
Okay.
So he has a math background. And so, yeah, I also have like, I took a lot of math classes, well, and sort of like pure math, like algebraic topology and stuff like that, which I always found to be, maybe I'm like interested in sort of, understanding design from first principles and like how can you conceive of design principles in some very abstract sense. And actually pure math has a lot to offer there, right? In terms of thinking about, how can we set up formal systems of how things can fit together. And so Alexander's thesis is kind of trying to join ideas that come from pure math with how do we think about sort of like the context within which you're going to make something and how that context weighs on its potential success on, whether or not it works. Simple. It's just like, does the house make sense in the neighborhood kind of thing?
Right.
But it's well-reasoned and it's interesting. Sure. Versus maybe the school that I came from, which is more like, is it beautiful by some, pretty arbitrary measure? Maybe that measure is within the culture that it's being measured or something. But I always found it pretty frustrating. I was kind of always fighting with the architecture faculty, productively so. I always found it like, how do you, locate what you're making within that tradition, especially I think towards the late 20th century when that tradition is starting to fracture and like not be totally cohesive. And so I think alternatively, Alexander puts forward a very cohesive, sort of, I guess, ideology. I don't really like the word ideology.
Sure.
Framework for how you can think about, basically like the success of a building or a network of buildings or city or neighborhood or whatever, like has to do with the quality of life that happens there. And so in some ways, not thinking about like, is this a beautiful object, but like, what is the felt effect of that object on the people who are there? And then if you can start to think about that felt effect, can you see that things potentially get linked together over long periods of history in ways that are kind of unexpected? And that there are like traditions of thinking about architecture that we don't actually, or like there are traditions present in architecture that we're not like thinking about as architects. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was very like, I think as a designer, it's easy to become a formalist, basically, like to only make things that are beautiful and to basically lose the thread of like, how is this impacting and like, how is this shaping the world, basically. So yeah, I always felt like there was this distinction between sort of like professionalized, like capital A architects, like, what proper noun, the people who practice architecture today, versus like lowercase a architecture, like sort of the ancient practice of architecture, which I think of as like, actually, I had a professor used to say, like, the architect is the person when you're wandering around the desert who says, okay, we live here now. Like it's just that simple recognition of like, this is the site, or like, this is what, here's how the houses are organized.
That's cool.
It's basically like the act of trying to organize culture. Right. And I think that, yeah, Alexander's kind of like the only person who's ever picked up that thread and does it in some ways in very formal ways in terms of how a house could be constructed to, be the most harmonious or, work the best as far as like family life is concerned or something. He gets very specific in some cases, but I always felt an affinity with his writing because it felt like someone who was thinking about architecture as this act of like shaping culture out of like built form. Right.
Very cool. Are there particular design details in Urbit that kind of have Christopher Alexander's signature on them in a way?
That's a good question. Not really. I mean, it's sort of built in the spirit though, right? Like,
well, I know that there was at a certain point a fork in the road for the development of Urbit where there was a kind of debate between going the API aggregation route versus the social networking route.
Yeah.
So it feels a little bit to me like Urbit did make a decision, or Tlon did make a decision at a certain point to go for the social aspect, the community aspect.
Yeah.
Is that in part a reflection of kind of what you're saying in this regard, that the architect has to basically foment culture, and it's the quality of the culture that's fomented that is the index of the architect's, success or quality?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So I would have never drawn that connection. That split happened because I met someone. I think I gave a talk that was about when we were first starting to develop this, like, okay, maybe we should connect all the stuff that you already use. And someone took me aside after the talk and said, hey, he had been a very senior person at Google. He had left to start this thing, and they'd been working on this thing for quite some time that basically did exactly that. He was like, hey, we've been building this thing. It's really far along. It's working reasonably well. And he like showed me a demo and we talked about it a lot. And he was basically like, no one really cares about all that data. Like, our problem is actually that we sign people up. It works. And I mean, it was a very impressive demo. And he was just like, the problem is that people don't want to connect all their services because the reality is they don't care that much about the data that's in those services. And I was like, that actually doesn't surprise me that much, because I feel like maybe there's kind of like there's like a myth that's been built around our attachment to sort of service-based media and communication, that it's just like so much more important than it actually is. Like, maybe it shows that this is interesting and there's something here, but people like, it could actually maybe all disappear tomorrow and like people wouldn't really care that much, just given the way that it's structured. So yeah, my intuition actually the API thing was something that was I never felt fully. I was like, I don't know about, like, I had this lurking suspicion it wasn't quite right. And then I had that conversation that made me think, okay, this is completely wrong. Because yeah, what you want to be building is something that feels more like somebody's home. Like, they put energy into it like you would your own house, that you think is going to last for a long time. And that is so much more valuable. But I think I also, even just from a tactical standpoint, thought that's a niche. Like, that's a product. Like, people need that, like, whether they realize it or not. Like, there's something to that basically we should build something self-contained, self-sustaining, that can kind of live on its own, rather than trying to, I'm like, the old world, I don't know, man, let's just let it go. It's fine. It doesn't matter.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Now, what is the Congo Gummi? And what did you learn? And what Gumi is it?
I think so, right?
I could be totally wrong. And what did you learn from them?
That's a good question. Well, okay. So for context, for those, I don't know if you would talk about Kongo Gumi.
Yeah, context is good.
Kongo Gumi was the oldest company in the world until not that long ago, when they were bought. But you can Google it. It's an interesting story. And let's see. I mean, I think the thing that's interesting to me, okay, so I've always looked at like, process is interesting to me. So it's probably more important how something is made, and than the sort of systems that are working on determining the conditions under which it is made. That's probably more important than what people think is going on when they're making it, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Right. So for some reason, okay, this is a little woo-woo or something, but I always thought this was really well captured in like Solowit, right? So you familiar with like Solowit painting? Solowit was like an abstract artist in the 70s who a lot of his paintings are just instructions. So they're a set of instructions. It's like an entire 15-foot by 8-foot wall covered with lines, all pointing different directions, not touching.
Okay.
And they're beautiful. Like, the paintings are actually quite beautiful. I mean, it varies, of course, but there's some pretty good stuff in there. And it's just what he sells, I'm pretty sure, is just the set of instructions. It's like, here, and then he has a team that will install the painting, but what you buy is just the algorithm. So anyway, I think when you think about, okay, you want there to exist a computing system, like, computers are promising, seems good. Maybe we can do something with this network computing thing. Like, it seems like it's a part of culture. And we'd like to have network computers that people can control, because if they could control them and shape them themselves, you'd probably have a healthier, more productive, I don't know, like, it would look different than it does today. Okay, well, part of the problem there is just the technical problem. So can you produce something of that nature? And it's a design problem maybe that's coupled to it, right? Can you also make it something that's easy to understand and easy to use? But you also need institutions to support that, right? Who can support the people who are making those things and have sort of some degree of sort of continuity or some ability to care for, like, and basically produce the situation in which, this thing can actually get made. And so what's interesting to me about like longstanding institutions is just how do they work and how do you actually make something like that? I think that there's this very, like, the default Silicon Valley way of thinking about these things in the whatever, I don't know, YC model, the IPO model.
Yeah.
Like, people don't think this way, really. They kind of do.
No, it's like make it as fast
but
as possible, make as much money as quickly as possible, basically.
Yeah, well, so there's something to, I think there is something to get really big, because getting really big does allow you to think about these things more concretely. So to be clear, I'm actually probably more interested in getting big by way of doing something good. Maybe is the important caveat for me. And I do think once you are big, you can think about these things in a different way. But certainly in the back of my mind, I'm always kind of thinking don't fuck it up, basically, right? So you don't want to do things that would kill you. Because there are going to be a lot of ups and downs. This could be a very long project. You don't know exactly how it's going to pan out. So it's important to look at these like fairly robust institutions. Like, what did they do? How did they work? And how did they think about, sort of like generational succession? Like, what's the culture of that company? How does that actually work? Those are hard problems that are not solved by that many US companies, I don't think. Maybe Apple, Apple's interesting in this way, actually. Like, it's very robust culturally, I think. I mean, there are plenty of problems with it, but it's pretty impressive, actually. There are some other ones probably that are more kind of like industrial. I mean, Toyota, amazing.
Right. But it definitely seems true that very few companies have as their mission the idea of building like 1,000-year long computer or something like that.
So this is where it's always weird to me. Like, there are kind of like foundation type people, right? Who it was like Long Now,
right,
or something like that, right? Where they're like, oh, we have this express goal to be a long-term institution. I think that's great, but I think like making money isn't good because you're making money. It's indicative of the fact that people are paying you for what you're making. And so I think, there's something sort of different about being like a very long-lived company, if that makes sense, right? It's like a different challenge because it forces you to be constantly, you're serving people, like you're making stuff for people, like, and the way that that you're making stuff that people like is that they're paying you for it. Right. And you want that to be this ongoing relationship. So you can't it's like Nintendo used to make card games, right?
Right.
Like, and if they were still making card games, they'd be dead.
Now, one of the reasons you don't see so many companies with such an explicit focus on building for the long term is probably because it's so hard, right? All the incentives seem to push people in the direction of shorter term horizons. So that's why I was asking you about the Congo Gumi or any other similar ventures in the past that maybe you've learned from. Like, I wonder, are there patterns or ingredients or principles that you've noticed are required or valuable for building this kind of really long time horizon company?
Yeah. So
you did mention one, which we could unpack if you want to. Like, you said something to the effect of, maybe you could recall what you said, but it was something like looking at the conditions under which good things are built rather than something else. Yeah.
Like, well, yes, I sort of think like great companies kind of like serve the people broadly by being able to understand, to kind of like create territory that people want to inhabit, right? Like, that's what creating new products or new technology generally is. In like a very, it's kind of vague, but I think it's pretty clear. So it's maybe important to point out that, like, Amazon doesn't really invent new technology, right? They mostly reuse existing technology to provide a service to the customer. It's a very different category of work to invent from scratch new technology. That's just a totally different thing. Most people don't do that. And I think that part of doing that, has to do with this almost like you have to be in touch with the zeitgeist or the way that people think and the conditions of the world you have to be like very sensitive to those things, basically, and start from your intuition of like what's going on in the world and where could the world go, basically. And you, as I was saying, it's sort of like in that sense of the architect being like, hey, here's where we're going to set up camp or whatever. It's sort of, you're doing that like over and over. And so I think that's a categorically different thing in general than like what we look at as like technology companies are not technology companies, meaning they don't invent technology. They just reuse technology. So how many technology companies are there? And and like what was their history like. So maybe that's what I'm always interested in. So Congo Gumi was a construction company for a long time, and actually they thrived originally because there was a boom in the creation of like Zen monastery. When Zen really took off in Japan, people wanted to build in a very particular way, and they were there to like service that demand and build in this very specific fashion. Yeah, I mean, that's potentially like a really, it's a good example of what I'm talking about, right? You're kind of like right there at the edge of what people want, and you're like inventing the way to service it with like literally new techniques, like new construction techniques, new ways of building, new ways of like providing something.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm not saying we've figured that out, but I think that's like, maybe it's just a personal interest in a way. I'm like, I don't know, that's what I'm good at. I'm not going to do anything else.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like you think very much in terms of not like building a thing and giving people the thing, but kind of gardening these environmental conditions in which other people will build things, or many people can build things, or where people want to live is something you said before.
Yeah. Sorry. So I'm thinking about this in terms of how do we create the conditions like at Tlon that people can basically make good products. But at the end of the day, we do want to be able to ship things that people, pick up and think, oh, this is really nice to use, and I want to use it without even thinking about it. Like I just take the act of using it. I just do this because it's nice. And I think, that's the thing probably that like I get the most excited about is when people are just like, oh, I like using this thing because it's sort of obvious. I don't even think about it.
Right.
That's hard to do though,
Of course. And I mean, when you look at Urbit, obviously it's been all these years of basically just architecting and building these conditions basically for networked computing to happen.
Yeah.
And we're at an exciting time now because there is kind of more adoption. There's more stuff to do. There's more people kind of talking about it, getting on the network, which I'm sure is very exciting for you. But for most of your history, contributing to Urbit, it's really been kind of creating this contextual architecture that one day, hopefully, people will be able to do things in and want to live in.
Yeah, it's just baby steps, right? So, like, I think that's one of the things actually I just think we're generally actually pretty good at now. We're getting better at. We'll be getting better at this forever. But one of the biggest challenges with inventing new things in general, right, is like not trying to do too much in any one step, or getting, confusing your kind of long-term vision with like what you can produce in the next, 1, 2, 3, 6 months, whatever. Some of the like really, I remember some of the early Urbit demos that I was like the most excited about, that I knew there were probably 10 other people who also found really exciting because they actually understood what was going on. But for most people, they were just like, who cares? And I think a lot of those, I remember a demo of like, we can update a scoreboard on 2 web browsers like simultaneously. But the fact that that was actually getting like computed down to NOC and moving over the wire, and like people who are engaged with this stuff technically, it was actually, quite compelling in exactly the way I'm talking about, right? It's like where you'd show this to a seasoned engineer or someone who's concerned with this type of technology, and they're like, holy shit, like that's fucking wild. Like, so you just have to, make sure you're not, if at that stage I was like, oh man, I wish there were, 1 million people using Urbit. I mean, it's pretty disappointing.
Right.
It wouldn't have been.
So good. At this very moment, we're at an interesting point with Urbit because what just released is software distribution. So now it's now possible for people to basically build apps on Urbit and then share them with other people on the network, so other people can download your app and use it. And of course, for people who don't know much about Urbit, you can certainly find better primers elsewhere. But the basic logic is that this is peer-to-peer networked computing. So basically, anything you can do with like a normal computer, now on Urbit, theoretically, we can build software that allows people to do that in a way that's interconnected, networked. So basically any kind of network logic, any network app that we have, like social media, you name it, can now be done potentially peer-to-peer with complete privacy on this like completely different internet. So I'm curious to know, now that software distribution is here, what are you most excited about in terms of the near future of apps in particular? Like what kinds of patterns do you expect to see in the shorter term of the first wave of apps to be built and shared and actually distributed and used across Urbit?
Yeah, it's a good question. The reality is I actually don't. What I'm excited about is that you can actually in earnest ask people to do this, right? And because the exciting part of building actual open-ended stuff like software distribution and the frameworks for it, which admittedly still do need a lot of work. The whole point is that they're like, people are going to come up with stuff that we can't think of, basically. That's the honest answer. It's like, I think what's most exciting to me is that now you have this like surface area of stuff that people can go after that I don't even, I mean, my area of focus in some ways with what we're doing now is actually pretty narrow. Like, I'm probably more interested in, I guess I'm excited about it. I mean, like, I think the thing that I feel like super motivated for us to work on, that I think, and I mean us by like Tlon. So Urbit as a community will go, I think, it now has the ability to kind of like go off and become more of an ecosystem where there's all of this like unknown stuff going on. The thing is that for people to actually get access to that ecosystem and to sort of feed it by way of like communities coming on board to the network, you still need like much, much better onboarding that is easy and cross-platform. You need much, much better frameworks for developers. Like, there's all this like baseline stuff of just making this available. And it's a funny situation because for me, even like a year ago, even like 18 months ago, like early landscape, I think it's a weird thing where you're like, this is a pretty good, I remember thinking like, okay, this is pretty good. Like, as a product that doesn't kind of like, isn't annoying, basically. Like, I find basically all cloud software to be incredibly annoying. Like, even if you're paying for it, it's like just has this pathetic.
What's the biggest annoyance? What's the most endemic annoying feature of
just like,
software services?
Do you want to turn notifications on? Like, I'm just like, no. And like, I never want to have to install another app ever again.
Right.
Or like on my phone. So anyway, I think like I could see just that. The quality of, hey, you can use this thing and it's never gonna like fuck with you, like it's just not an sort of, there's nothing pathetic about it. Like, it does exactly what it says it's going to do. It can last an incredibly long time. It belongs to you. And people have tried this angle with software before, but it's always actually kind of not true because it's just not actually, they haven't like sort of realized the whole technical vision. And so for me, the most motivating thing since I had this sense of like, okay, I think this is pretty good. And you could see it be validated, pretty continuously by other people having that same, not in huge numbers, but mostly because it's so fucking hard to get on and use this thing. And so, the thing I'm just like I want to be able to like text someone an invitation, have them sign up, have the whole flow happen, conveniently and seamlessly, without them really thinking about it. And I sort of feel like with the software distribution stuff, I'm like, people are excited to explore this space, which is, very encouraging to me. And I'm curious to see what they will do. I almost like don't want to influence them. I'm just excited to see what happens.
Gotcha.
Like, I think that's like,
well, so like one hypothesis would be, should we expect a lineup of Urbit basics? I think someone in a previous interview used that term.
Yeah.
So like, is there going to be like an Urbit, Google Docs, there's going to be an Urbit, Excel, there's going to be, like, this is a
good question. So, and I get mixed up. So I should, in a way, back up and like, I think in terms of like, almost like the next quarter or 2 quarters, like that I can like, we plan very concretely about like, what are we going to do in the next 3 months? What are we going to do in the next 6 months? Beyond that, we actually like just don't plan. We know where we're going in the next maybe 3 to 5 years, roughly, but don't, and talk about that. And that kind of sets your like general direction. The reason I'm always talking about, I don't skate anymore, but I do spend
me
a lot
neither.
of time in those. You can't skate.
As you get older, it hurts so bad. To fall hurts so bad.
I have a lot of respect for people who still do skate. It's
dude,
amazing,
I used to like fall off roofs and stuff like crazy, and I was just like made of rubber back then. It's crazy how your body changes.
So
it's sad.
It's also
RIP to skating. Yeah.
I'll still like roll around, but I can't do it. But I think that Urbit at this point has this. I spend a lot of time like out in the woods on my bike, on just hiking, whatever, backcountry skiing, stuff like that. And I think of it a lot like, especially actually when you're out in the snow, you're like, okay, I need to get up there. And if you're in the snow, the cool thing about being in the snow, right, is you can kind of just go anywhere. There's not like, you don't need to be on a trail. And so you can see as far as like through the trees to a certain extent, and you can see probably the peak you're trying to get to, but like the in between, like you're like, well, I think there's a couloir over there, like kind of, but not really. It's a lot like that. Right. So I think that I'm talking very much about like next 3 to 6 months. I have like this fixation on just like make the barrier to entry like true. Software distribution was a huge effort. It was the important thing for us to get out, but I like really want that to come down. The sort of digital basics thing, which we'll talk about actually this weekend quite a lot, is these two things are complementary. So one way to think about it, to draw back to stuff I've been saying now, for a really long time, is like WeChat, Line, Kakao Talk. In the East, you have these like super apps where I can send you a message, I can send you a payment, we can book dinner, we can pay for dinner together, I can write a blog post, I can do everything in a single unified UI. It looks amazing. I mean, I've only used these things by talking to other people and having them use them and show them to me, but it's pretty cool. Also, still centralized, has all the downsides of centralization, but you can see like, oh, this is kind of like a networked computer with a real operating system. And so Urbit now has the basic pieces in place to get to that, but like it's a real actual operating system, meaning like you can install whatever you want on it. It actually belongs to you. Yeah, it's in fact peer-to-peer. And so I think that vision of like, sure, yeah, you have this very rudimentary set of digital basics, very much in the spirit of like a Muji type of Muji computing. Sure, you need documents, you need messaging, you need payments. I need a way to manage my bank account. I need a way to manage all the sensors in my house. I need, sure, look at all the things that you're already using. You're using them productively, like they are useful. But what if you could just get rid of like sort of all of the bullshit and have them feel like they are totally durable and they belong to you completely, and simplify them enormously. I think that's kind of like where we're headed. You look at like, it's a Western WeChat, but that doesn't have the sort of poisonous, side of it, meaning like there's no centralization involved.
Yeah, it's awesome. I think that's a really great way to summarize it. How do you think about the future of businesses being built on Urbit? We talked earlier today with Christian and Logan of the Terrell Corp, and they're, to my knowledge, one of the first, ambitious startups, proper startups being built on Urbit.
Yeah.
Do you expect to see a wave of other startups like that? Yeah. Maybe not for a while. And if so, what types of opportunities do you think are the most promising or exciting? Like if there's an investor listening to this or an engineer or potential founder, like what's the prime territory in your view for the near future of building startups on Urbit?
It sort of depends on your level of ambition.
Yeah.
That's funny. I thought you were going to ask this in a different context of like, because Terrell, I think of as building tools for people to build businesses on Urbit, like businesses like your own, right? Like, meaning like supporting individual creators or kind of like, individual businesses, of which I think it could be very creator based, or it could be that I make something and I sell it over Urbit in interesting ways.
Right.
And I think there's a lot there, and I think that I think Terrell, I don't know if they fully sort of cornered that market, but like they're definitely. They have a long road ahead of stuff.
I mean, I guess one question would be, do you see like boutique app developers being profitable anytime soon? Or is that the wrong way to think about the software economy on Urbit?
I think that you'll eventually get there. I think that people will probably figure out how to get there. Although I had a conversation the other day that almost convinced me otherwise. So building software is fun. I mean, it really is genuinely fun. I think most people build software at first because it's fun. And we live, especially in the world of crypto, in this, I don't know, people I feel like sometimes think too much about the incentives, right? It's like, okay, well, how are people going to make money? They have to make money. Okay, I agree they have to make money. I think people are initially motivated by just wanting to do stuff that is really cool. I think Urbit makes it easy for you to do stuff that is cool because you're shipping software. You're not doing DevOps. You're just making something and sending it to your friends. They get to run it. Then if you're doing that either by doing a grant or because some large address space holder is paying you in ownership of the network, you kind of like are now a co-owner, right? So it's like you're a Windows developer, it's 1995, and like by shipping whatever accounting software, you actually just own a piece of the operating system itself. And, the thesis on Urbit value is always that like, as Urbit gets more usable, it gets more, it makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. Why would I pay for a planet? Why would I pay a star to route packets for me, whatever? That boils down to like, what do I get to do with this thing? So I think there's potentially this like really nice feedback loop between people contributing software to the network, us and other large address space holders trying to give people shared ownership in the network as a whole, as a means of, basically sort of keeping them inspired, but also keeping them out of having to run a software business, much of which sucks. You want to be able to see people doing this basically for fun. So, but look, the reality is we don't know. And
Sure.
I think you can look at, what's happened like in the Ethereum ecosystem and to some extent in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So I think there's big opportunities for people to run services on Urbit in general. So whether that's like hosting services, whether that's like off Urbit compute or storage services, whether that's payment services or calling out to the outside world. So what Terrell is doing with credit card companies is interesting, or like with credit, being able to like run, connect to regular dollars, but also just banking, right? I would love to be able to have a way that I interface with a bank over Urbit itself, or by calling out or authenticating with Urbit. And so that's where, in the same way that there's like, there are Bitcoin exchanges, Bitcoin services companies, but like, do people really build apps for Bitcoin? Not really, maybe more so in the Ethereum ecosystem. And in many cases, those apps are just for fun. Like people are just kind of putting them out there. Maybe they sort of they mint something with them. Maybe they have some shared ownership over something, but they're not trying to build like a Coinbase or a BitGo or a whatever. So I think there will be a few larger services companies, and some people have started some of those already, or they seem to be getting off the ground. And I mean, who knows which ones will be really successful. But I do think for a while, like software development and distribution will be I think building software for Urbit is just so much easier and more fun than we're used to, that people will do it out of the joy of doing it. It's just so much easier than you would it's nothing like, traditional software development.
Let's fast forward, say 100 years. It's 2121.
I'm frozen in some.
How many people are using Urbit? How are they using Urbit? In what ways? What do you see on that kind of time horizon?
Yeah.
So how has Urbit penetrated the world?
I think that the best thing to compare Urbit to in some ways, not in other ways, is probably just Unix or Linux, right? So, almost every app or service that you use runs on top of a Unix machine somewhere. Pretty much the internet is not the internet. It's really like the internet plus like Internet Protocol Suite plus Unix. Mm-hmm. And you would hope that Urbit as a piece of technology or as a platform, becomes this like totally invisible, ubiquitous layer of basically like networked compute. So if you want to talk about the kind of like, Neil Stephenson, nanobots and whatever, a completely and totally connected world that is maybe somehow not as dystopian as those novels are, or maybe more optimistically, like you look at like Brett Victor, like Seeing Spaces type of stuff. The missing piece for all that stuff is something like Urbit. But for most people, Urbit is completely invisible. It's not important. Like it's as important. I mean, maybe how many people know what Unix is? I mean, some people kind of, it doesn't matter, Mm-hmm. And the way that you enter into using that thing is probably through something else. I mean, sure, it's a little bit different because in our case, you like own an identity. But I mean, even that, it's not important that it's like Urbit branded, right? I mean, Urbit is meant to disappear, like and become this kind of like fabric of computing.
Yeah.
It's designed that way. I think we're on track. It's a long project.
Sure. Will there be Urbit hardware or maybe not?
Probably. It's very unclear how long that would take. You can look at, a simple way to think about it is that we sort of tend to move towards special purpose compute hardware, right? And crypto networks have really proven this out. And so if Urbit is extremely, widely used, and so you have entire data centers that are dedicated to hosting Urbits for people, it's obviously going to be, more efficient if you can run that on metal that is well suited to running Urbit. I say obvious probably more emphatically than I should. Maybe it's easier to run it on a hypervisor of some kind, or it's still running on Unix somewhere. The point of Urbit's design is similar to the way, of course, like you ran the internet over analog wires and then eventually you replaced it all with fiber. It's like, do we need to replace it all with NOC chips? I don't know, maybe. Like, could do.
Maybe not.
I mean, should you have like Urbit? Do I want like an Urbit phone, which may actually be running Android under the hood, but is only able to, boots into an Urbit interface? Oh yeah, definitely. Like, people will do that, like for sure. People have already experimented with that.
Are there people doing that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not even that. Someone, I think Anthony for a while had like an e-ink phone. You can buy this it's not a super high quality piece of hardware, but it's decent. E-ink phone that would boot directly into and just like only show you landscape, and it's pretty amazing. Like it's pretty nice.
That's cool. Yeah, if there are people floating around this weekend who have cool little hack jobs or rigs that I'd like to see.
I mean, there's so much like enthusiasm with Raspberry, this sort of like Raspberry Pi contingent.
Right.
These guys running all kinds of crazy stuff on little Raspberry Pis running.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more about what people are building. It's really interesting. So something I've been enjoying asking people is maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the most interesting stuff you found or people you've met, or just like what's some of the cool stuff you've ever encountered on the Urbit network?
A long time ago, it's the first thing that comes to mind. There was someone who built an entire MUD, so like a multi-user dungeon style game.
Okay.
Meaning it's like a text-based adventure game.
It doesn't sound fun, but
yeah, I'm not super into text-based adventures. Some people love them; they are interesting.
A single dungeon sounds bad enough, but multi dungeons that just sounds like some kind of torture.
It's a throwback to like early days of networked computing. So you didn't it's a terminal game where it says like, hey, you're in a dark room. You can either go north, south, east, or west. Or you can like look around. You can like run commands, and it tells you where you are. Right. But a multi-user dungeon. So first they would have these text-based adventure games, but a multi-user one meant that you could actually talk to if you encountered other people, meaning if you were in the same room, you could talk to them. So there was someone who years ago actually went and implemented an entire MUD for Urbit. And I'd never talked to this person before, and they showed up in Urbit and then were like, hey, install this from my Urbit, like before software distribution exists. So kind of hacked a version of software distribution together.
Wow. And
was like, run this and I'll talk to you there, basically. And a few of us ended up like inside of this text-based adventure game where we were talking with someone who we never met before, inside of a world that they had kind of created. So anyway, I always loved that one. That's
fascinating.
Yeah, it's wild and great. And this is someone who then actually ended up working with us for a long time, and
nice.
Is a great supporter of the project and someone I like a lot. But that's basically how I met him, which is kind of cool. This is like, there's so many.
I mean, yeah. That's a good one, though.
Urbit attracts incredibly interesting and strange people. Like, that's my experience.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Yeah. So this has been really fun. We covered a lot of ground. I mean, I think that's more than enough for now. I'll be talking with you, I'm sure, more throughout the weekend. Tlon is just a very fascinating company. It's a truly unique company in Silicon Valley. I think it's the only company I've ever encountered where you ask, some of the leading people working for it, what they're trying to do, and you get like the most interesting answers that you don't hear from other, technology companies. It's like talking to Ed, he'll say something like, his goal is to make computers beautiful or something, and like you're like, yeah, I want to make a 1,000-year computer or something. It's like not many people in Silicon Valley are like building companies that have these I guess it is a company that is built by designers in a way. It has that mark on it because it's like you're really thinking about what is beautiful, what should exist, what is the principled way of doing things. That's what I feel like the vibe is at Tlon, and I think it shows, and I think it's unique and really cool.
Thanks. I think maybe to like the way you're making me realize, the way I think about this is like, people love terra incognita, right? Everyone wants to look go to sort of the edge of what is possible and explore new territory. And I do think that like Tlon is a company that's very much like Urbit as a thing, right? Is sort of saying, look, the internet is hosed. This territory isn't interesting anyway. We're just going to create an entirely new territory that we think has like rules that actually make sense. And we're going to let people explore it and develop it. And so I think we think of our job is basically to kind of like create that territory, make sure it makes sense, make sure that people can explore it. I mean, but that's both fun, like for us, and the idea is to make it fun for other people too. So I do think it's generally like I don't know, sort of feels like a positive feedback loop.
Hell yeah. Yeah. Awesome, dude. Well, thanks for sharing your time with us today. And is there anywhere you want to send people? I think you mentioned before you're hiring. Anything else you want to tell people about?
Yeah, we're always looking for people.
What are you looking for in particular, other than skilled engineers, obviously?
I still haven't. Well, you can look at our careers page. So there are specific people that we're hiring for. But my experience is that, it's sort of like if you feel very inspired by what we're doing and you're really, really interested in it, we generally hire people who contribute. And so if you're sort of interested in Urbit and feel like you want to participate, please do, and reach out to us, and we're pretty easy to find and like talking to people.
Right on. And other than hiring, any other calls to action, or you want to send people anywhere?
I feel like
else?
your listeners know, like, what usually I'm like, just go to urbit.org. Or like, no, not really. Get it. Yeah. Come check, if you're not on the network, it's pretty easy to get on, and you should check it out and see what's going on.
I have my own little on-ramp, so I'll put links in the show notes for people to get on the network and
follow your
learn more.
You're helping make that easier. All right. You're working on the thing that I'm the most frustrated by. So that's good.
Oh, right on. Right. Which is getting people on, making it easier to get people on. Yeah, totally. Well, I've enjoyed my time on there. It's a really interesting little system, and I like how simple it is. And I'm down with the mission, as you know. So I'd love to see it succeed, and I'm happy to throw my weight behind it. So it's been fun.
Well, I'm glad we got to talk. It's been, I don't think we've done this before. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Galen. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sure.
All right, that's a wrap. Thanks, man. That's great.